South Africa's history has undoubtedly been marked by strife and oppression between ethnic groups, at least as far back as when the first European settlers arrived in 1652. In his book, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela comments that the exact same realities can be interpreted differently through the lens of different worldviews. He says, "I was just becoming aware of the history of racial oppression in my own country and saw the struggle in South Africa as purely racial. But the Communist Party saw South Africa's problems through the lens of the class struggle. To them, it was a matter of the haves oppressing the have-nots." What is the right way to look at South Africa's history? In this video, I'll briefly summarize the history and suggest what I think is the right lens through which to view it, the lens of the Christian worldview. The original settlers of South Africa are believed to be the San and Khoikhoi, hunter-gatherers and herders whose rock art can still be seen, for example, in the Drakensberg Mountains. The Bible teaches in Genesis 10 that all nations on earth today are descended from Noah, who survived the world flood. Of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, only the descendants of Ham moved and settled to the south of present-day Israel. And it's therefore reasonable to assume that the first settlers of South Africa, the San and Khoikhoi, were descendants of Ham. Archaeological discoveries indicate these tribes arrived in South Africa around the time of Jesus Christ. European settlement of South Africa is generally considered to have started in 1652, with the establishment of the Dutch East India Company at the Cape. The Dutch settlers were the forebears of what are today known as the Afrikaners, whose language, Afrikaans, is similar to Dutch. Both the Dutch and the British who came later to South Africa are, in the terms of Genesis 10, likely to be the descendants of Japheth. The Dutch came into conflict with the Khoikhoi over land ownership, and the Khoikhoi were driven out of the Cape by the end of the 17th century. This was perhaps the beginning of what is often known as racial conflict in South Africa, at least between white and black. Yet, biblically speaking and ethnographically, racial conflict is a misnomer.
Let's talk about the word race. Sometimes when people use the word, they mean supposed races of people who have evolved at different times, rates, and in different locations. That's not true. Of course, the word race is also a term we use to distinguish between groups with different physical traits, namely skin color. But are there really different races? Take a gander at Acts 17:26, where it is written that God, from one man, made every nation of men. It's clear then that the Bible teaches that there is one race, the human race.
Towards the end of the 18th century, the British played an increasing role in trade at the Cape, and in 1815 the British paid the Dutch £6 million for the Cape Colony. The Dutch language was outlawed in 1806, and slavery was abolished by Britain in 1834. Both of these were factors which led to the great trek of Dutch-speaking white farmers, or Boers, who had relied on black slave labour, eastwards away from the Cape and into the interior of South Africa. This brought the Afrikaners into conflict with Bantu peoples such as the Zulu, who had migrated to South Africa around 500 AD, for example in the Battle of Blood River, where the Afrikaners massacred around 3,000 Zulus. The discovery of natural resources in South Africa, diamonds in the 1860s at Kimberley and then gold in the 1880s on the Witwatersrand, the area around Johannesburg, was a game-changer in South Africa. The mines established to extract diamonds and gold were as economically viable as they were only because African labourers, and later imported labourers, were paid a pittance to work in dangerous, brutal and onerous conditions. Though the British had abolished slavery half a century earlier, British industrialists such as Cecil Rhodes, co-founder of the De Beers Consolidated Mines, themselves made fortunes on the backs of African workers whose conditions were little, if any, better than those of slaves. The discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand, one area the Afrikaners had trekked to in their desire to establish their independence from the British, who had initially supplanted the Afrikaners in the Cape, also brought renewed conflict between the British and Afrikaner Boers. The British forcefully annexed the Transvaal Boer Republic in 1877, and 2 wars were fought between the British and Afrikaners between 1880 and 1902. These wars were triggered by Afrikaner resentment of the British and have been characterized as a contest over the massive wealth in the Witwatersrand gold mines. The Afrikaners were defeated in 1902, and the British unified the 4 colonies, Transvaal, Orange Free State, the Cape Colony and Natal, into the Union of South Africa. In this union, voting rights were denied to those of non-European descent. In the 1913 Natives Land Act, white people, who constituted 20% of the population, were allocated 90% of the land. The Union was a 2-party state, but since only Europeans could vote, African interests were not represented. One party, the South African National Party, was pro-British and stood for white unity. The other, the National Party, stood for Afrikaner interests. Jan Smuts, of the pro-British South African National Party, was influential in both the First and Second World Wars as an ally to Great Britain against the German Empire and then Nazi Germany. However, Afrikaner resentment against the British clearly still simmered because, in a surprise result, Smuts lost the 1948 elections to the Afrikaner National Party.
Daniel Malan wears the new smile before taking up the premiership.
The National Party governed from 1948 to 1991 and formalised the existing system of discrimination into the legal system of apartheid.
How long could South Africa remain a white man's country?
I would argue that one of the goals of apartheid was to enable South Africa, and in particular the white citizens of South Africa, to continue to enjoy the benefits of the cheap labour of Africans and other non-Europeans, but to come into contact with the people on whose labour they depended as little as possible.
Unfortunately, the rulers of South Africa want matters both ways, cheap labour and segregation. Hence the recent rioting against having to carry passes.
Those of non-European descent were still denied any vote and relegated to second-class conditions. The African National Congress, or ANC, which had existed since 1912, came into its own through a mainly non-violent policy of resistance to the apartheid regime, standing on an African nationalist platform. Despite its stance of non-violence, the ANC was not tolerated by the government, who resorted to increasingly brutal, one might say desperate, attempts to cement their own grip on power. But especially with Western sanctions and increasing international condemnation of South Africa, this was not sustainable. Apartheid was rescinded in 1991, and the first democratic elections were held in 1994.
This day is a very big day for us.
Unsurprisingly, since only about 1 in 7 of the population then was white, the African National Congress, on its African nationalist platform, won the election and has been in power since. Few now mourn the passing away of the evils of apartheid. But evil in South Africa, just as elsewhere in the world, is more than just the evil of what Nelson Mandela called racial oppression.
In a corrupt society, almost anyone or anything can be bought for a price.
As we've seen, the discovery of diamonds and gold caused massive upheavals and the exploitation of workers, who are often African, by industrialists who are often European. Nelson Mandela remarked that the Communist Party saw this as the oppression of the have-nots by the haves. But I believe both Mandela's African nationalism and atheistic communism missed the mark. The lens of a biblical worldview gives insight into both the economic and ethnic sides of oppression in South Africa. On economic oppression, the Apostle James says the following, which seems particularly appropriate to South Africa.
Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire.
There is definitely places that I don't go at all by myself. Or if I go there, I must carry my gun or something.
It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure.
The police are doing stop and search for illegal firearms,
drugs. See, here used to be a biggest hotel where the drug trafficking was huge here, just here.
Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter.
I'll show you something here. Something. My G. See, yeah, there's a business going on here. And drugs.
You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you.
Could much of the pain have been avoided if the mining industrialists, and all those in South Africa who employed slaves or domestic workers, had taken these words to heart? And on the subject of ethnic oppression,
I am going to bring foreigners against you, the most ruthless of nations. They will draw their swords against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor.
So were Europeans brought to South Africa by a god who was displeased, for example, with the divination practiced by the Sangomas, who are still today a part of traditional African culture? And then, were the British and Dutch induced to war against one another because God was displeased with their failure to pay their workers their due wage? Was the ANC God's instrument to bring down a European regime which legislated the treatment of African people, the ancient brothers of Europeans in the family of Noah, as little better than animals? We can only guess, but we do know from Psalm 34 that
The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth.
And while the end of apartheid was the end of one type of evil in South Africa, more deep-rooted evil remains. For one thing, the evil of apartheid has arguably been replaced by the evil of corruption.
This historic moment, the result of a $10 million bribe.
The 2010 FIFA World Cup will be organized in South Africa.
There is widespread dissatisfaction in South Africa today with government services and maladministration.
It shows that corruption in South Africa is increasing year on year. And with the probe around President Jacob Zuma's private residence making headlines, many question the misuse of funds by government officials.
I'm really not comfortable with the state of corruption here in South Africa. And the worst part of it is that we vote for these guys and it's starting from the top, those guys that we put them there in top by our votes.
It's either you have the poor outcome of the maybe the project. The people are not getting what they're supposed to be getting. If they get that, it's of poor quality because of corruption. So it really impacts.
Despite increases in taxes and fees, for example, like the controversial expansion of road tolls around the country, which are an especially heavy burden on the poorest South Africans, the deterioration in the country's roads would suggest that the government revenues are being misappropriated or fraudulently misdirected. Power outages, known locally as load shedding, are now an almost everyday occurrence. The Bible, of course, speaks out against bribery, corruption, and dishonest gain, just as it does against economic oppression. In addition, the South African economy, in particular the mining industry, continues to depend heavily on cheap labour. From the mid-1990s to 2015, the population of South Africa has grown over 40%, from about 38 million to 54 million. This increase has been fueled by migration from elsewhere in Africa, and many of the African migrants have ended up as part of the mining workforce. Labour unrest and violence has continued, with riot police killing 34 miners as recently as 2012. And then in 2015 there was a new type of violence, by Africans already in the country against African migrants accused of taking jobs from the first group. Could God have brought these migrants into the country just as he did with the other people groups earlier in his displeasure against corruption? In summary, no tribe, tongue, or nation is faultless. The whole human race has fallen from perfection. But according to the Bible, there will be representatives of every tribe, tongue, and nation in heaven. Revelation 7 says that these are those who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. This is the Lamb Jesus, who takes away the sins of every tribe, tongue, and nation. For South Africa, just as for every other country, the answer is not nationalism, communism, or any other ism, but to turn to Jesus Christ and have our sin taken away so that God no longer counts it against us. This is ultimately the only way to the abolition of interethnic hostilities, the only way to unity, and the only way to rid ourselves of economic oppression. Turn to Jesus today, and may the day of his perfect reign come soon.